welcome you to the first of the 2022 SAIA Transformation Webinar Series. This time you're here for Panel 2, A New Table. I also would like to thank our sponsors and our friends at Zappel Steel for their generous contributions in helping us realize this Transformation Webinar Series. My name is Adima Davis. I will be your facilitator this afternoon. I'm an architect and academic at the Durban University of Technology, and I serve along with my colleagues on the SAIA National Transformation Committee and represent transformation in my region, KwaZulu-Natal, where I serve as President, Vice President, and Chair of Transformation. As Karuni highlighted in our panel 1 this morning, SAIA was established in 1927, so today's call for meaningful commitment to change is somewhat overdue, but as they say, better late than never. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm, an advocate, all-round inspiration, and the first African-American woman elected to the United States Congress, without the support of her party's leadership, by the way, said, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." 54 years later, acutely aware of the presence of politics in architecture, as raised by our panelists this morning, we discuss the reality of the necessity for a new table entirely this afternoon. Pulling up a seat sounds exemplary. It is the bold move necessary to be seen and heard that many of my predecessors, and myself to some extent, have had to play. I in no way want to discredit their work and experience, but this move has perpetuated the notion of superficial change through representation versus meaningful revolution in the architectural institution. As our SAIA President, Professor Amir Osman stated, and our morning panel expanded upon, transformation is multidimensional. It is a love-centered revolution. We have been left exhausted by our folding chairs, and we come together today to ask that this new table reflects exactly that, love and revolution. I am so pleased to introduce our panelists today, each of whom are new to the SAIA space, and I hope that we all hold tightly to the opportunity to listen, reflect, and collectively make room for them and others. I am joined by Dr. Jennifer Mirembe, our Panel 1 facilitator, who is graciously bearing the load of facilitating with me this afternoon, followed by our panelists, Leila Peterson, Firdaus Murat, and Chelsea Smith, our UCT Master Student Cohort, Bongeka Mnguni and Sonali Chetty, a young practitioner and academic from the KZN region, Katleho Lebete, a practitioner and academic from Swane, Letlabile Shubane, a young Johannesburg academic, Michle Mlezana, a young Eastern Cape academic, and Lynette Thabo and Boitumelo Masela, who are my fellow SAIA regional transformational champions. I'm thrilled to invite them all, and you can tell by the smile on my face. So without further ado, I invite our first panelists to the floor. Firdaus, Leila, and Chelsea, thank you.
Please remember to switch on your webcam as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Myself, Firdaus Murat, Leila Peterson, and Chelsea Smith are Master of Architecture students at the University of Cape Town. Contributing to a new table, we'll have a discussion on notions of equity and inclusion, which will be broken into the representation of race, gender, and sexuality. This discussion stems from our personal university experience, that being undergraduate and postgraduate studies in the Department of Architecture, and how these can be combated through crafting a new table in the field of architecture. The next slide, please. Race representation in undergraduate versus postgraduate studies varies. Undergraduate studies present a more diverse demographic of students, and this could potentially stem from a systematic approach from the university to showcase a need for transformation. Postgraduate studies, however, becomes more inaccessible to previously disadvantaged students due to the lack of funding, opportunities, and the affordability for honors, masters, and PhDs. There has been, however, a movement to have a diverse teaching cohort to reflect diversity we see in students. This notion should be extended to the external moderating body who are invited to critique our work. It is important that the students feel represented and understood by the people who grade their work. Many projects stem from personal backgrounds which aim to represent marginalized communities and using architecture as a tool to catalyze change. Many of these projects reimagine transformation for the post-apartheid South Africa and are often left on the shelves. It is important that practice allows exit students to continue these value systems in projects to materialize transformation. Next slide, please.
Okay. So speaking on the topic of gender representation in undergraduate studies versus postgraduate studies, movements such as the Fees Must Fall movement sparked a broader conversation about transformation in the university space. This conversation was extended in the architecture department to address issues of decoloniality, but also highlighted other problems such as an unequal representation of genders. And this provoked a specific push from the built environment to prioritize female students in architecture and engineering at large. At postgraduate level, we see that the systems put in place to prioritize gender equality have been carried through. Architecture has traditionally been a male-dominated industry, so what this transformation in the university space does is address these disparities we see in architectural practice by ensuring that there's more female graduates going into industry. When institutions speak about transformation, it's often held only within a conversation about race, which excludes the issue of female exclusion in the field of architecture. External examiner panels are usually praised for being diverse when the examiners are from different races and cultures, but often still exist as a panel of men. So what we need to move towards is a space where architecture students are afforded the opportunity to be taught, critiqued, and examined by a fair, unbiased panel of individuals who can relate to and understand student identities and perspectives. Often, female architects are steered out of practice by patriarchal systems that deem women to be more suited to interior design roles. So initiatives such as the Y Project offer support spaces specifically for females and females of color to encourage a stronger connection to women working in the built environment. In addition to this, there is the Her Perspective initiative, brought about by the need to recover Black and POC female voices in the field of architecture. The initiative aims to recover stories and contributions that women have made in the field of architecture in South Africa and globally through public participation in the form of a growing digital timeline. The initiative strives to build a worldwide archive that challenges the underrepresentation of women in architecture across time. By resurrecting histories, they attempt to redefine the limited narrative of who qualifies as an architect, therefore leveling the playing field for future generations. Next slide.
The conversation of representation of sexuality is often neglected in architecture, while it should be equally prioritized. Universities generally have policies in place to promote safe and respectful spaces for all sexual orientations. However, architecture departments usually negate and distance themselves from the conversation at large. While studio projects and themes address issues of race and inequality, this should be extended to queer issues. Queer issues should not only exist between queer identities, but should rather be included as an equally important and valid topic, which affects how students and staff engage with architecture. Architecture should not remove itself from these issues, as it is directly responsible for creating inclusionary space for all. Next slide, please. Although we as two women of color in architecture, we recognize that we have diverse experiences of discrimination within architecture. This is why we find it important to acknowledge our intersectionality. Intersectionality is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression, and that in the field of architecture, it should consider everything and anything that can marginalize people, such as gender, race, class, sexual orientation, physical ability, etc. The goal of crafting a new table is to embrace and acknowledge these allied diverse practices and as an essential part of intersectionality. It explores how an intersectional approach recognizes the different types of discrimination as points of overlap or as coming together at a point of intersection. We know that intersectionality in architecture and built environment disciplines is not just about the politics of recognition, but it extends to a framework of collective responsibility and action towards practices that are inclusive, egalitarian, and socially just.
And next slide, please. Next again, we skipped a slide. Okay. Next slide. The underrepresentation of many ethnic groups in architectural practice translates not only to inequities within the profession, but also the missed opportunities in business. Leveraging the benefits of our diverse workforce requires a culture of inclusion and equity. Achieving a culture like this requires the celebration of differences among people and, more importantly, the elimination of obstacles that underserved and underrepresented face to access the same opportunities that others have. A prime example of this would be the way in which underserved students lacking personal connections and a financial safety net have double landing internships, many of which offer little, if any, pay.
Some notions of exclusion in architecture at school begins at a social level, and if not addressed, it can manifest in institutional systems. Examples of this can be seen during exam periods where printing and material costs can become a financial burden for some, while for others this is not an issue. This can be mitigated by institutions putting the correct measures in place.
In crafting a new table, architectural institutions could find new ways of exhibiting work that doesn't require traditional ways of printing. We're evolving into a world of technology that allows us to showcase our skills digitally.
We often see in architecture school this culture of all-nighters and students committing their lives to their studies. This culture, although positive for some productivity, is very dangerous for a number of reasons. To be able to invest all of one's time and energy into their studies is a privilege that not everyone has. Many students have to juggle their household responsibilities, whether that be caring for elderly parents or young siblings alongside their studies. In crafting a new table, it's important that lecturers and teaching staff have a realistic grasp on the realities of student backgrounds. So to conclude, the many initiatives and publications on topics that deal with inclusion and diversity in architectural practice have already caused the sensitivity of the implicit and explicit influence of colonial impositions and gender models to increase. One cannot claim, however, that the problematic discrimination and disempowerment of many minority groups in the theory and practice of architecture has stopped. The influence of old traditions and practices remains very present, and not all teachers and researchers in the field follow the recent publications closely. So this threatens to create the effect that inclusion and diversity in architecture is seen as a kind of research specialization that's only important to the directly affected and interested parties, while the relevant insights do not seep through into the broader architectural discourse. So by creating a new table, we have an opportunity to provide spaces where these conversations of inclusivity and equity are at the forefront and outdated practices in the field of architecture can be constructively critiqued. Thank you.
Thank you to our UCT cohort. At this point, I'd like to ask all of our attendees, for those of you that didn't join us this morning, to please feel free to engage with our panelists using the Q&A and discussion sessions, so we can hear what your thoughts are, what your inputs are, compliment, comment, and engage with our panelists throughout the afternoon. I'd like to welcome our second panelist to the floor, Bongeka Mnguni. Bongeka?
Thank you, Adima, and good afternoon to the audience at large. My contribution today is divided into 4 stages. I assure you it has nothing to do with load shedding, but it's just how I can best paint the picture of my journey. Next slide, please. So I'll begin by posing this question. Have you ever been invited to an event, but you don't feel welcome? You have a seat, but you can't afford anything that's on the menu. That's how it feels like to be Black in an elitist industry such as architecture. Entering first year, I quickly learned that I'm smart and talented enough to be in this course, but what I have to offer is often overlooked. I was conditioned to believe that I had to work twice as hard to only get half of what my male white classmates might have had. And then I wondered, am I only here as a statistic to tick off a box for the institution that yes, there are Black females studying architecture? What is often overlooked by the institution is that the mere presence of Black females in an elitist field doesn't eliminate the prejudice that comes with inequality. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. In the same space of feeling the realities of inequality in the studio, I brought my folding chair and advocated for all of us who were silent. But even then, I was mocked and called a good politician just for having the guts to speak. What a bland stereotype. I felt the invisible load one bears of being in a leadership position or being the face of a movement, but the heaviest load was that of the forces around me that enforce segregation and silencing. You aren't a real architect. A line I've heard being said to so many of my classmates, yet I struggled to understand what that even meant. This line haunted so many students, and not many crossed over it. And again, I wondered, what image are we supposed to mirror? That of the Vitruvian man? So, why do I label this stage as architecture? It's not just a play on words and how grueling the workload is. That's a conversation we continue to have. It's more about highlighting that the studio is only a microcosm of the social ills that exist in our country, a reproduction of the exclusion. They are only further exacerbated in the studio. From this, I've realized that the experience of architectural education is important in analyzing the conditions and issues that exist, as it may affect the progress of transformation in the social sphere of our discipline, which brings me to stage 2. Next slide, please. So, archi-torture produces archi-trauma. This phenomenon gets played out in the work environment. We shape our buildings, and thereafter, they shape us. When I think of this quote, I often wonder about the cycle between the designer, the work environment, and the building, the final product. What type of buildings are produced from toxic work environments? Will we see spatial transformation if the discipline of architecture, that is, the people that practice, are not socially reflective of the values we talk so eloquently about? I hope that we can have more transparent conversations in our respective workplaces when it comes to topics like salaries. I hope I never have to trade stories again about the time my race and gender were a factor when it came to remuneration, or about the time I was pregnant and excluded from working on certain projects, or about the time my name was excluded from the credits when the project I worked on received recognition, or the many times I'm treated as a commodity to increase the scoring for a bid. I can only speak of my experience and the daunting account I may hear from others, but I just want to highlight that transformation isn't a faraway concept. It should be in our daily lived realities, in our individual silos. It is in the ethics of each individual and being able to be accountable for your role and how these inequalities are reinforced and played out, and maybe due to your ignorance. It's hard to accept being a part of a rainbow nation when, in my experience, I experienced exclusion in Black and white. Then onto the archaic MTR system. My first impression of it is that the journey to becoming an architect seems quite linear and rigid. A form follows function approach. There's not much room for exploration and doesn't respond to the current methods or even emerging niches of practice. While there is validity and necessity to have the system, I think it needs some renovations like any old building. We have 4 categories that guide which areas of expertise you need to encounter so that you qualify to write the PPE. Anything outside of that is just regarded as other. How can the system better reflect the changes in practice, and who decides the parameters? Each candidate is responsible for attaining the relevant experience, but we all know that there's limits to accessing certain information in our workplaces just as an employee. Well, because of gatekeeping. Is the candidacy system only designed to produce employees? What other support measures are put in place for emerging practitioners? Can the idea of the mentor be more meaningful outside of what SAIA has just stipulated? Next slide, please. Then on to stage 3, which I just call practical completion. Congratulations. The archi-torture and archi-trauma was worth it. You are now a professional. SAIA can now add one more digit to the withering numbers of Black professionals. But just as we know, practical completion, the project isn't over. You haven't worked for more than 10 years, so you're still in the same position you're in as a candidate. But the reality is still the same. New levels, same devils. Archi-trauma 2.0. How much space can you actually occupy in the industry? There are various elements that can stunt your ability to advance your career, but some are systemic, like the financial, emotional, and mental cost of admission into postgraduate studies, and the fears of exploitation and lack of support in venturing off on your own and opening your own practice. Then there's the option of entering the public sector, like me, where we're not heard because of our age and not respected because we aren't deemed real architects by members of our industry. While reflecting on this presentation, I remember starting off my journey with around 100 faces in my first year, a community of sorts. We were voluntarily bound by the studio. We are now only bound by CPD points and venting about SAIA fees. I grew up with the philosophy that states that it takes a village to raise a child. Each member of the community has an influence and responsibility for the growth, protection, provision, and overall wellness of the child. And I wondered how this philosophy could be applied in the architectural community. If we had a platform where each young professional can have access to more than just one member of the community, which would ensure safe passage from each of these 4 stages. A platform that allows you to grow in skills, be protected in your work environment, provided with safety and accountability, and ensure overall wellness. Next slide, please. So on to stage 4, which is what I call final completion or the maintenance phase. Again, the project never really ends. So this is where I open up the discussion to the rest of the panel and attendees. I'd just like to add a few items to the menu of the table we are currently sitting at. To the members of the Institute, firstly, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to make a contribution. Access is an important aspect of inclusion. Representation is important. We cannot be what we have not seen. But I also like to conclude that mentorship isn't a privilege or just a CPD benefit. It is a survival mechanism of the industry. We needed to be more intentional, value-based, humanistic, and not just institutional or transactional. And I hope that a conversation like this may spark some overdue conversations in our own private workspaces and even personal spaces, that it doesn't end just in the chat box of this webinar. These issues that we experience are our reality, but not our collective identity. And then to the young professionals, I'd just like to say that there is validity in our numbers. The greater our numbers, the louder our voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Bongeka. So once again, I ask our attendees to engage in our platforms to ask questions and share your comments and compliments. But I think at this point, before I welcome our next panelist, I also want to talk to the necessity of this panel coming together in order to create a new table. And what we're doing is not trying to create a fluffy pink space where we can all feel safe to share our woes, but what we're actually doing is affording ourselves the opportunity to be heard meaningfully by everyone. And hopefully that can go towards the construction of a brave space. And what that means is that it draws us all into accountability for how, where, and why we create this new table. And so thank you, Bongeka, for your generous sharing. And I would like to welcome our next panelist, Sonali Chetty, to share this afternoon. Sonali.
Thanks, Adima. And I just want to say thanks to the presenters so far as well. I feel like I know that story. I feel like I can connect with those stories. I have an experience of architecture from multiple kind of institutions. So I started my journey at UCT. I did my undergraduate degree in architecture at UCT. And then I moved to do my master's in architecture at UKZN. I also worked in between my undergrad and my postgrad in industry for a few years. And after I completed my master's, I started working within the Durban University of Technology. And now I work as an academic, as a program coordinator, as a lecturer, as a researcher in the interior design program. And my PhD research which it's kind of related to my experience as a female architect, or as a person within an architectural space. My PhD research relates to post-secondary learning spaces and learning institutions, and that was primarily driven by my transition from kind of student to educator, which I think it was a meaningful transition for me. Each stage of my education had a very different meaning, and it was a very different experience. And I think that even looking back, experiencing it now would be completely different for me if I had to go back to UCT, or if I had to do a master's now. It's a completely different time of my life. And I love that Bongeka brought up the invisible workload, because it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot. This idea of us working and constantly producing is something that I really can relate to. I feel like if I'm not productive enough, if I'm not hyper productive, that I'm not doing enough. I feel like if I get found out at some point that I'm not doing enough, that I possibly have a mild dose of imposter syndrome as well. And so my research really is looking at informal, non-formal, and formal learning and formal learning experiences. And I think what I've realized is that architecture promotes formal learning experiences and doesn't quite take into consideration the informal and the non-formal and how that impacts the individual. So when I hear from the panelists who are talking about their experiences at UCT and at UKZN, I can completely empathize, because I feel like those were non-formal and informal learning experiences for me, in the sense that I was unintentionally learning from underrepresentation, from underrepresentation of females, from underrepresentation of women of color in these spaces. And so constantly trying to prove myself at the same time. I was also learning from studio culture. That was also something that was brought up. This idea that we need to be working all the time, that we need to stay up all night, and if we haven't, then we haven't actually produced something of value. Although when I was in it and when I was in the center of it, I thought that that was how it was meant to be, because I didn't realize that I should be questioning things like that at that time. I took it for what it was. And looking back, there are definitely some elements to it that are quite problematic and quite troubling and quite difficult to grasp even now. So that pushed us, and I think that architecture pushes us to do more and to produce more. And because we constantly feel like, or I constantly feel like I'm trying to prove myself, I don't really quite know where I stand within architecture. And especially now that I'm working in an institution and I'm also doing my PhD, and although I am a registered professional architect as well, I feel quite isolated from my discipline. I feel quite disconnected from it. And I think that could be for a number of reasons. And I think that that idea of formality comes through quite strongly here. Firstly, I work within an interior design program and not within architecture, but I think that the way people perceive interior design is slightly different to the way that they perceive architecture as well. Secondly, it's almost as though the more we further our education, the further away I feel from architecture and from the practicing side of architecture. And it's not that I don't foresee myself at some point working in practice as well, or that that isn't something that I would have realized for myself. It's more that there is quite a divide between academia and practice, which is quite an interesting thing for me to admit, because my academic experience shaped me. It brought me to where I am today. And then further to that, this idea of my PhD research talking about informality and non-formal learning. I work within a PhD cohort, which is known as the Spatial Humanities Project. And it's really quite an exciting journey to be on, because I get to partake in a kind of pilot project with researchers and PhD students and master students from other disciplines, not specifically from architecture. Some of them are from the humanities, some are from town planning, and we meet regularly and learn about the spatial humanities as a methodological approach to kind of understanding spaces and connecting spaces to qualitative experience. So it's this idea of the quantitative GIS map and envisioning space and what they mean to people on a qualitative level at the same time. And there's this overlay and overlap of information that really produces a well-considered and kind of interesting dynamic between the qualitative and the quantitative. And being able to understand space from a humanities perspective, I think is really, really valuable. And so that's why this project has been quite meaningful for me. So working within this space where I feel quite heard, I feel also that we are collaborating and that we're learning from one another, even though we're not necessarily working on the same project and our PhD topics are not necessarily the same. I think there's so much value in exchanging and engaging across disciplines. And so when I was thinking about how I wanted to frame this discussion and my perspective on architecture, my experience on architecture, I thought to myself that sometimes it feels like architecture is very much existing in a silo, and that's possibly one of the reasons why I feel disconnected from it when I'm not practicing. And so I feel like there's a lot more value in this interdisciplinary approach, and I feel like I'm contributing a little bit more. And I also think just in general, the appreciation for interdisciplinarity when it comes to architecture is not highlighted as much as it could be. Because we aren't always working alone. We generally do work with other consultants and we work with people from other disciplines. I think that this kind of approach is something that we could perhaps question and could perhaps bring to this table. Really, how can we connect with other disciplines and how can we make that more apparent, that connection more apparent, so that it strengthens us and not so that it takes away from anything that we feel like we've built already, because that's not the aim of it. And I know that we have built a lot already, and I know that people have been striving a lot more. And so as a woman trying to prove myself constantly, it's nice to be in spaces like that that support us. And so exactly what Bongeka was saying about needing supports within our discipline, I completely and wholeheartedly agree. And I think that perhaps interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinary work could promote something like that as well. And it's something that we could perhaps look at in the future. And just in conclusion, I am really grateful to be a part of a space like this. It's not something that I had considered prior to my master's. And I think that it has really shaped a lot of what I am saying, a lot of what I'm feeling today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonali. And I think there's so many kind of overlapping narratives that are coming between between each of our panelists. But one of the things that kind of sticks out is the intention that the SAIA National Transformation Committee had in casting the net wider than the usual kind of handful of what a colleague of mine refers to as the poster children for transformation. There was an intention to seek other meaningful voices that might not ordinarily have had the opportunity to engage in this platform. And so I'm really appreciative to all of the panelists this afternoon, and want to introduce our next panelist. If you can come to the fore and share with us. Katlego.
What is an architect? Well, the term architect comes from the Greek root word architekton, with archi meaning to be first who commands and tekton meaning mason or builder. So we should be commanders in chief for the built environment, right? Well, in my experience, either the client, property investor, or developer who usually has the money is the commander, creating knowledge and speed limitations when it comes to the delivery of green and economically efficient buildings whether retrofitted, refurbished, or newly built. Unfortunately, this means that the plus 61 million bed target for the country, along with other accommodations issues, will continue to persist if we don't develop systems to expose women of color to the property investment systems available in the country. During my studies, access to decent student accommodation was something I took for granted until I realized that stability in access had an impact on student progress and whether or not one could graduate in record time, in an extended time, or not at all. Even though the issue is more complex than my statement, as previous panelists have alluded to, a multifaceted approach, which includes the new table of architects being equipped to also become property investors, can also assist to reduce the accommodation shortfall. Now, with any conversation about building and placemaking, the business of land tenure and productivity is an underlying factor. If this has a corresponding impact on personal, communal, and patriotic economic progress, we really need to commit to the development of an inclusive body by aggressively educating and supporting the women at this table to engage thoroughly in the business of buildings. Another aspect to consider is opening up the enterprise development dialogues for female architects of color to further support product research, development, manufacturing, and marketing outside of the confinements of architectural practice, so as to encourage sustainable entrepreneurial maneuvers that can help remove the glass ceilings which so often obstruct developmental progress in the industry, from as early as student development through to professional development and enterprise establishment. In all of the above, in engaging with the Institute of Architects, my understanding of the objective is to eventually realize a reasonable return on investment for time spent studying for the profession for all the previously marginalized groups engaged in the conversation. The request for the making of a new table can assist in bridging the knowledge shortfalls that continue to obstruct the progress of its seat takers. In ensuring that the table is not only for talking, but also for actioning strategy, we can ensure that the new table can also increase in capacity as new graduates enter the field. In our ability to see things that do not exist into existence, our execution of the aligned roles can assist in developing previously underserved markets so that the society we dream to see can improve in existing places of operation. And we can ensure that the seed bearers come full circle efficiently and effectively in the business of building and placemaking as commanders-in-chief of the built environment. Thank you.
Whether it is building an educational toy for a baby, developing accommodation facilities for students, or contributing to the construction of our country, we have to drive the vehicle for social change. For the love of peace, safety, and prosperity, our work can and will outlive us. With the Greta Thunberg generation being very energetic and aggressive in their approach against climate change, let them find us actively architecting, by example, for the beneficial extension of this planet to their generation and the generations after them. In the difficulty of the challenge, we need to remember the 1956 triumph that supported our dream to be here today. In our efforts, let us also support the dreams of those whose visions are still unfolding. May our strength be made stronger in the unity of our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Katlego. I'd like to just take a moment because I feel like I must, before I introduce our next panelist. We've been receiving comments from our attendees for our panelist presentation so far, and I spoke about the overlaps between our panelists, but evidently there are overlaps with our attendees as well. Following Bongeka, your presentation, we heard from Nompilo, who says, yes, Bongeka, so well presented. I am all for a new table. It has been spoken about, but can it please be created now? Putting my hand up. From Eva, I think female exclusion in our industry has always unfortunately existed. I've been called all sorts of names when I was younger. Only experience has reduced the bias. But that is my experience. Eva, I think that is a lot of our experiences. From Ketsitse, thank you. I have always asked these questions. Why did I earn less than someone who has less experience than me? I was the first one retrenched despite entering the same time as a white counterpart. I have found I still work twice as hard just to prove myself. Sonali, your research is really interesting, says Fundiswa, as architecture is interdisciplinary, but there is no space for that in architectural education. Leading to our next panelist this afternoon, Letlabile. I think that's a perfect entry point. Letlabile is in architectural education. And so Letlabile, if you can share with us, it would be lovely to have you on board. Thank you.
Thanks. I changed my, wonderful. So hi, thanks. Thanks, Adimo. Good morning, everyone. I'm Letlabile Shobane, and I'm a professional architect, and I have been for a few years now. And I do practice, but most of my time, in fact, is taken up in the academic space. And it's not necessarily where I saw my career headed when I was studying, is in an academic space. In fact, mostly as a student, I was kind of irritated by that which is overly theoretical and critical. And because I've had questions on how much impact that has. However, my experience of practice, I would say, is what brought me here into the academic space. I do enjoy students. I enjoy interaction. Just to be clear, it's not. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a cynic teaching architecture. That would be wrong. Just to say that it's not where I saw my career headed initially. I became an architect to practice architecture and to kind of work on buildings and to shape my city. And I'm mainly based at UJ, the University of Johannesburg, and I've worked a bit at WITS and have been exposed to being a student at WITS, both in my undergrad and postgraduate degrees in architecture. And more recently, I've been a student of urbanism at KU Leuven in Belgium. And I've worked in kind of various practices throughout the years. And when asked by Adima to think about exclusionary practices in our industry, I had to think quite hard, actually. I think there are the kind of obvious ways in which we're excluded on campus as students, and I think that's been mentioned by my colleagues. And there's obviously a huge amount of gatekeeping when trying to access certain spaces, both literally and figuratively. And so there are obvious exclusions in architecture. But I wanted to kind of think about, something perhaps that I haven't said 1,000 times before. And the other reason it's difficult for me is that as a kind of teacher or lecturer at UJ, the students I teach are having a vastly kind of different experience in terms of representation than I did. At WITS, as a first year, about 12 years ago, we are quite a diverse team, both as part-time lecturers and in management positions. It is quite a breath of fresh air, as I say, when I think about what my experience of a first-year student was all those years ago, at UJ at least. I can't speak about other institutions, obviously. And their experience of kind of who is teaching them and who is examining them is vastly different. And I think we can attribute that to kind of the global decolonial movement and the fees must fall movement here locally, and diversity conversations worldwide. And obviously we're grateful to students for seeing that change. It was a necessary one. But anyway, it's another kind of reason that this discussion was maybe a bit more difficult for me to think of something useful to say. We haven't obviously, however, moved far enough. And when I listen to kind of master students talk now, maybe I'm wrong about how big the gap is, how much change has actually been made over the past kind of decade. But anyway, as I say, in my experience, we're doing slightly better than we were. And my quarrel really is more with industry. Why has industry not moved as students have moved, or as students have forced us to move? We're present. When I say we, I'm talking women color and women. We're present in kind of architecture school, very present, in fact. We maybe have higher numbers. And then we disappear slightly when we move into the profession. And why is that? Because, you know, as we all know, we put a lot into completing that degree. It's a huge amount of work. It's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of time and sacrifice. And that's kind of the nature of the degree at its core, I think, on a global level. And so it's almost a kind of shock that we aren't as present in industry as we are in academic spaces. The third and final reason it's difficult for me to talk about specifically around Women's Day is that we are not monolithic, right? We all come from different spaces, and we will never have the same experiences or backgrounds. And it's quite difficult actually for me to sit on panels around Women's Day and women's exclusion, because it sometimes can be quite a reductive process. However, I am excited to be chatting here today, and I have, on a personal level, been excluded. Okay, so and been excluded within our profession, and a lot of this was a choice to leave the profession, but I attribute most of it to kind of the nature of the industry. And why is it that I left my office space? What is it that prevents me from going back, or the idea of going back? And again, as I say, why is the industry not moved? And for me personally, the answer to that has been that as a sole practitioner and as an academic, I've been able to be far more kind of flexible. Okay, just to be completely honest. The rigidity of the profession and the rigidity of the workday, I find fundamentally exclusionary. And there are other kind of various reasons for what led me to leave an office space, but I'd like to talk to that one mainly today, as it's mainly what pushed me out. Okay, so I think, I mean, architecture, I think perhaps globally, but certainly within Johannesburg and South Africa, has got a huge kind of culture of control and surveillance. Okay, and this operates under the guise of what we call studio culture, all right, which has been mentioned before. And I think it's useful perhaps at an academic level. You know, all of us in academic spaces have obviously seen the impact of being at home over the past 2 years. I've seen it in the quality of work of students, and in how students can kind of operate amongst and with one another. And so I'm not suggesting that was a good thing. However, what we call studio culture, I think is a cover, okay, for something else. And I was hopeful that COVID would do something to shift that. And it has in a few other industries. You know, folks have become more open to ideas around flexible hours and flexible workspaces. And I think we have not as a profession. Okay, and I think we really have to kind of look at that going forward. Right from when students are groomed into architecture, they are taught that they have to be a certain way. And this has maybe been spoken about already by everyone so far, that you have to stay up all night, you have to sacrifice a social life, and you must forget about any other priorities you have. All right, and this is reflected in practice, where this is the incredibly rigid workday and the feeling of being watched and not trusted. So obviously, when there is that culture, those who are not dominant in those practice spaces are most affected by that, particularly in small practices, which architecture has relative to other professions. We have a huge number of small and medium practices. So I'm not saying studio culture is not a thing. I think we've all seen, as I say, the results, particularly in teaching. We've definitely seen the impact of students not being in studio, and the impacts of isolation. But what I think we've replaced that by is a very oppressive, controlling culture. Okay, and I think industry professionals need to question how much of our work days require that kind of rigidity that is embedded in it, far more than other industries. yeah, so where we can't be less rigid, I think where it's necessary that people do work in group workspaces, I think representation in management positions becomes incredibly important, and that's been mentioned before. And the culture of control is also obviously strengthened when there's diverse office spaces. Okay, and this is where diverse management teams and diverse representation become extremely important. And I think with that regard, with my experience in Belgium, I think we are falling behind kind of global standards, right, as far as flexi time. So in conclusion, I think there is the question I'm asking is where is the line between what we call studio culture and a culture of control and surveillance. Unfortunately, what I've experienced in practice in this country and in the city is a culture of control, okay, being called something else, particularly within the oppressive past that we kind of occupy, all right? There's far too much room for diversity to dwindle and for kind of super oppressive structures to be upheld. Thank you. My apologies for the background noise.
No background noise. Thanks, Klappy. I think what was the one thing, and I think I'm really grateful to be able to sit with it for a little while, is that question of where is the line between culture and control. It's something that I think we have all experienced, this idea of what you're conditioned to assume as the normative versus your own expression. So thank you for sharing so generously. I'd like to invite our next panelist, Mihle, to share. Mihle, please, can you join us? And then thank you to the attendees for engaging so enthusiastically. I'd encourage more comments, compliments, questions, counter narratives, even if you can keep sharing those for our presenters to take forward in closing. Thank you. Mihle.
Thank you very much, Adima, and a very good afternoon to my fellow panelists and to the audience at large. My contribution to today's discussion is my lived experience. So I completed my Master of Architecture in 2020 at the Nelson Mandela University, graduated in 2021, and I've been a candidate architect in the workforce for just over 15 months now. My journey towards professional architecture, registration, began as an arduous and very lonely one in varsity. It was plagued with imposter syndrome due to being a young woman of color in a predominantly white male-dominated department. But fortunately for me, the workplace has been a very positive experience for both my professional growth and for my mental well-being. I'm grateful for that. I'm going to share a few words said by Megan Singh, the head of business intelligence at New Media and fellow person of color, most importantly. And her sentiments sum up my own perspective on today's discussion around the new table, particularly for young women of color as a previously marginalized demographic in the context of transformation in our profession. She says, sometimes all you can do is hold space for someone, listen to them and make sure that they feel heard. Then hold open a previously shut door and allow them to enter the room. Help them find a seat at the table and then nudge them into speaking up. It's a slow process, but even small progress is better than none. So based on my own experience as an architect in training, as I said, I feel strongly about a new table being set to serve more interaction between students and professional structures such as SACAP and its subsidiaries, mainly for the benefit of the student and the candidate. I feel there's definitely a need for interventions on the toxic studio culture in our varsity institutions, as touched on by a couple of other panelists, as well as in private practice workplaces, by the way, that exploit and promote this overproductivity thing. And there's a need for interventions on the isolation often faced by architecture students, which undoubtedly leads to this high dropout rate in architecture departments by women of color, based on my own observation. There's definitely a need for mentorship platforms and forums for candidates, facilitated by experienced professionals, of course. And I feel like this student professional interaction might also ease the often, overwhelming transition from, student to candidate and architect and ultimately professional. And it'll certainly, I think, bridge the divide between students and professionals, as Sonali mentioned. But my overarching feeling is that this platform and dialogue is definitely a noble step towards the right intention of playing catch up on the pursuit of equity and visibility for both students and women of color practicing in the architecture profession. I definitely appreciate the space currently being held for us just to share our experiences and issues, as said by Megan, and I definitely acknowledge the considerable progress being made towards transformation in our profession in particular. I'm definitely eagerly anticipating representation of more young, inspirational women of color at the helm of our own, professional structures and student bodies, as principals, most importantly, of their own, successful practices in the near future. So yeah, thank you so much, Adima.
Thank you, Michle. Before I call in our final duo of panelists, Lynette and Boitumelo, I must say that between Letabile and Michle's presentations, as you were talking, the words of the late Ntembeni Mkhize, the former CEO of SAIA and former head of school at UKZN, where I studied, came to mind. And he would calmly say to me when I was venting my own frustrations in the kind of architectural pseudo-political space that our institutions find themselves in, but he would calmly say to me, we actively just need to keep the door open. We need to make sure that the door is left open. And I'm going to leave that as an entry point into Lynette and Boitumelo, who will share with us now. Lynette, Boitumelo.
Afternoon, everyone. It's actually a wonderful thing to be here today, and to be really challenged in terms of how we see transformation in the architectural space. And talking about the sleep table, myself, I've been in the industry for about 8 years. I studied at University. I finished my postgrad there as well. And it's been a recurring kind of conversation in terms of how we start to rethink this sleep table. And being in the industry for so long and listening to our panelists this morning, and I'm thinking to myself and listening to the UCT students, what else can we look at? How do things change and what can we learn from people that came before us so that we don't repeat the same things, we don't repeat the same conversations. And so what I picked up, I'll start off with just looking back and reflecting on what our UCT panelists spoke about. And the main overarching theme for me that I picked up was representation. But how does this representation look like in terms of now looking at reimagining that we don't call architecture, like my other panelists said. How then do we not repeat or recycle the issue of architrauma? And be really truthful in our identity in terms of representation. And this morning, Karina put up a very important topic to say, as a woman coming to this new table, I think the most important thing is authenticity and identity. And I think if we work according to ourselves and be honest with who we are, and not trying to be looked at like what the industry is showing us in terms of it being male dominated, but having room for us to be ourselves within the table, and that authenticity and that truth of coming to the table as you are gives you the space to be able to say, listen, this is who I am, this is what my ideas are. And maybe that as well, having women that actually start to cultivate other women within the table to say, like those one of our friends are saying, nudge the other women to say, you are welcome and this is your table and this is your tea. Because when you bring your chair forward, you are comfortable enough to say, this is who I am, this is what I want to say. And as an institution at SAIA, I think it's very important that all these narratives and all these issues and all these concerns that have been brought forward, how do we take that and start building? How do we take that and say, these are the tables that we bring forward? And so the image that you're seeing right now in front of you is exactly that. Bring your folding table, bring your folding chair, your folding chair, and then come to the table. And then after that, when you're comfortable in your own chair, you're comfortable enough and you've got the confidence to say, this is what my ideas are, this is what I want to say as an architect, as a black female, as a white female, as whatever sexuality you are, whatever gender. I don't think it's an issue of gender and sexuality versus race, but I think it's layered in terms of if I'm truthful with my own identity, then I'm very much able to come to the table with my sovereignty and I can say what I need to say and then we heard about it. And so when you are here in terms of who you are, even if you come to a table full of men, because you know who you are therefore given that conversation, I am going to take up space. As Ms. Universe said at one time, you must take up space. And so it becomes very important to say, this is how I am represented. This is how I represent myself. And only that bit of confidence to say, this is how I represent myself, will in turn encourage the rest of the females that you're sitting with to say, this is how they come forth. Again, when I get to say earlier on that there is space and there is a way to move forward when we are all present at the table. But we can't be present as individuals or work in silos because then that's not going to do anything for us. I mean, in my own experience, I've realized that being isolated and being by yourself and thinking you're the only one going through this, it doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't give you space to move forward and say, this is how we're changing it. It's going to get situation where in 10 years' time, we're talking about the same thing and nothing is actually being done to actually say, we're not just ticking boxes in terms of numbers, but we are actually making a way forward to say, this is how we're changing it. And so, but I think all of it starts with true, authentic representation within our university spaces, within our institutions and universities, and within our industry. I'll hand over to Liz to finish off the conversation.
Thanks. Thank you, Jimmy. Yes, thank you, ladies, for the great contribution, I must say. I think we've all related. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, all good.
Perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, so I think, well, just a brief background about myself. I'm Lynette. I studied my undergrad at CPUT, and then I concluded at Wits University, and I did urban design. And I think one of the reasons why I ended up detouring towards urban design was how most of the conversations panned out throughout this entire webinar. And what I wanted to reiterate, I think somebody made a comment, I think it was Nompilo, if I'm correct, but just adding on to what everybody was saying and contributing. And my one thing that came up was, yes, I'm sure as women, we've all experienced the same concerns or the same issues. And this spans down from varsity back to getting into industry. And I'm sure we all exhausted of all these nice chats, but there's just no movement. And I liked what Litabile said, that in academia and within students, I'm in academia as well. And I feel like our part of architecture in academia, or our little industry within academia, wouldn't really say it's an industry, but I feel that there has been transformation. So these chats have become a driving engine of some sort. It might be slow, but it's at least moving. And the question that I keep on asking myself, and one of the reasons why I left industry was that very relatable to Rita Vida, was that I felt like I was hitting, or I was gonna hit a glass ceiling, and I'd never get to the place where I see myself in the next 20 years, because I could already paint the picture, and it was very clear that this is the route that I'm going to walk in, and this is where it ends. I'd rather escape, and I can make more contribution within more students that come into industry. But I do believe that there needs to, or there's still more work that needs to be done within industry when it comes to being more flexible and more inclusive for women, more especially. And just touching on what Katleho said, like building more sustainable measures of teaching, of developing, and just including women within the table. So this image we liked so much because it's very colorful. The chairs are all not the same. And I think in architecture, given that architecture is so formal, this would be considered informal. And I think it sparks that conversation that we'd like to also see as women, that it doesn't matter where this chair has been or what color it looks, just be brave enough to come to the table and contribute. And who knows, maybe we will break that ceiling and create more room for more women in spaces, well, in industry spaces, unlike what we have now seen in academia. What we have now seen in academia as a more inclusive space than it is in industry. But as a lecturer, I find that our graduates are at a disadvantage because it almost feels like we're mass producing these numbers of students, but they have nowhere to go, or they'll have a cap at one stage in their careers, whether it's a salary cap, whether it's a position cap within the firm that they find themselves in. And I'd honestly like for us to think a little deeper into how we see our industry as women and as women of color, and the representation that the three ladies had mentioned earlier from UCT. But one thing that I wanted to close off with is that the conditioning of how one is supposed to behave in architecture might be detrimental to how we evolve or tap into transformation as a fraternity. And I do feel that the more we start thinking of these doing things within education, within that transition between your final year of varsity, your internship, and incoming a graduate into your office, that matters, because that also determines how that one lady 2 years later will bring that chair to the table and actually contributes a meaningful contributes a meaningful message or interaction or something, or a system that we might need within our fraternity as architecture, be it in academia, be it in industry. And yeah, I think that's all from me. And I'd like to thank you once again for this great opportunity to be able to share a voice with so many beautiful ladies. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette and Boitumelo. So I'd like to invite Dr. Jennifer Mirembe to put her camera on, because for the next few minutes, we're going to be reflecting on panel 2 and then jumping back to a reflection on session 1 this morning around making equitable leadership for women within the institutional space. And so I was floored by the comment that came in from Jabu Makube, who says, very thoughtful. Okay, thanks, Karina. Thank you. Sorry about that. So let's jump back to Jabu's comment. Jabu, thought-provoking as always. For those of you that know Jabu, he brings such meaningful contributions to this space. Jabu says, very thoughtful presentations. I wonder if we can harness this energy, perhaps through building a new table, a Women Institute of Architects, revive the Black Institute of Architects, and formulate our own agenda outside the existing problematic gaze. And I was saying that I've grappled with this for a while, and I think part of the creation of the platform today for session 2 around a new table was, I suppose, my own resistance and retaliation to the expectation of needing to make new spaces to be seen as someone who doesn't fit the mold of the modern architect, you know, the bespectacled 50-plus old white male architect. And I suppose this idea that I have is in holding space and occupying space within the Institute, it allows us to refuse to fight for agency within, you know, patriarchal power. And Mona Al-Tahawi speaks to this idea of the patriarchy and oppression being an octopus. So she describes the head of the octopus as patriarchy, with each of the legs as things like racism, sexism, ableism, anti-trans movements, anti-ableism, you know, and classism, and so this, and colorism as well. And so I think this idea of finding new spaces is necessary, but I also think that within the conditions of the Institute that we have heard from this morning's panel and this afternoon's, and I talk to the Institute as being both the learning and the professional institutions, is that more and more we need to be seen and acknowledged as being a part of this. You know, truthfully, we are all, well, the majority of us are all architects. We all function within the architectural space. So is there a need to create these, to further create these additional silos for us outside of the home? Because to me, that protects the notions that we are saying are toxic within our institutional environments, those conditions that set the white male as the normative. And so I know that a lot of people have spoken to their experiences today, and I'm so grateful again to you all for sharing so generously. And I'd like to invite Jennifer, if you can come into the space, just to kind of stitch between the two panels and reflect on session 1, and we can pull back and then invite our panelists into a bit of a discussion thereafter. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Adima, and thanks to all the panelists. I think it was very interesting to see the discussion. And for those of us who were in architecture school over 30 years ago, it was amazing it's as if the same story still exists, you know, 30 years later. But be that as it may, I mean, this morning when we started with the question about reimagining leadership and the question of gender equity. And we had 4 panelists. We had Professor Amira Osman, who took us into the future. She started off with a discussion on the future of work. And I guess some of that, I'll just speak to some of that now as it has come out in the second session. And then we also had architect Mabela, who took us into the global world, the different designs, fashions that happen in the global arena, but again, reminding us about the voice. What do we want to see ourselves within the global space, or using the same vocabulary that's been used in session 2, what type of seat do you want at the global table? If we could ask it that way. I mean, using the language that has come out in the second. And then we also had architect Karuni, who took us into confidence and a lot of the injustice, if I may call it, that's happening within the architectural space, especially also in the Institute, the whole issue of power, top down, bottom up, balancing, not balancing, accountability. How do we remain accountable? Who do we account to? Why? And so on. And then the whole question of equity, and then the question of color. That's come out a lot in section 2. Black women, women of color. And I think architect Karen also brought that in session 1, where she shared some of her experiences and some of the how do we manage power, and how do we begin to rethink leadership within that question of the power, the strength of the power within a system that holds into power, as she said it. And then architect Volk also came in with a very interesting context where she talked about the servant leader, or what she called, she called the reluctant leader. I think that was very poetic and a very strong metaphor to show, okay, now that we're talking gender equity and we're talking leadership, what does that mean? I think just seeing, I think I'll just talk about session 1 within the language that has come out of session 2. If we see some of the overlaps between Professor Amira Osman and then Bongeka and Katlego. Some of the, for instance, Professor Osman talked about the whole issue about stepping up the voices, how you balance the voice, which voice you listen to. And then we see Bongeka also talking about architect torture and architect trauma, and then the final completion. But I think within that we see the link, the connection to Professor Osman's presentation in terms of the voices at the table. And then Katlek also coming in with the different circumstances we find ourselves in, where we're coming from. But again, I've rephrased that to say the families at the table and the opportunities at the table. And we see that connecting with what Prof. Osman was talking about this morning, the voices and the future, where are we going and how are we going to get there? Which voice will we listen to? Then if we see what architect Karini talked about, she stated a very strong question about a reality check for each one of us, which is, am I conflicted? But above all, the courage to show up and stand up. And we see that playing out in Leila's presentation and Miller's presentation, but where they talked about gender representation, equity, inclusivity, diversity. But taking from that is the new sentence about all are welcome to the table. All are included at the table, right? And then we see architect Mabela's presentation about the global picture connecting to the local, but you see how that plays out again with Somalia and Letabile's presentation, as well as Shubane's presentation, people who've been to different parts. But again, it comes up to, I've just concluded that by saying the types of seats at the table, the families at the table, because now we're talking about the built environment space. So how do we reimagine? How do we lead? And how do we look at the table within the families that we bring to the table? We've got engineers to work with, surveyors, interior designers, and so on. And then lastly, architect Walker's presentation about the reluctant leader. But again, we see how that connects beautifully with Botomela's presentation. Come as you are to the table, and there is a space at the table, as well as, I like the biggest one, bring your folding chair to the table. So I think what's interesting about today, Architect Adima, we begin to see really interesting things about how we reimagine leadership, bringing in gender equity. We have to see that we're moving forward towards gender equity, but again, within the future, within the new world, what does that mean? And then we redefine this table. I think I'll touch more on that after the Q&A session into the conclusions. Back to you, Adima.
Thanks, Jennifer. And yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I'm sure that those of our attendees who were able to join for panel 1 this morning and panel 2 this afternoon, that you've picked up on these evident overlaps that we are speaking to this idea again. And Flavi, you framed it really succinctly. We are not a monolith. And talking to the idea of how complex overcoming the very sophisticated system of exclusion that exists within our world at large, but specifically today within the architectural institution. And so I think I'm going to ask our panelists if you can get ready to join us on screen. But before we do that, I'd like to talk to Sapphire Steel, our sponsors, and just get Christopher Knightis with us, if you don't mind. Putting your camera on, Chris, and if you can join us briefly, say a few words from our very generous sponsors. I keep saying generous, Chris, so it's a seed to plant that we're so gracious for your sponsorship. Please do it again next year. But I'm going to let Chris intro Sapphire Steel once more. Thank you very much, everybody. And following the sponsors talk and presentation, Dr. Jennifer Maremba will then open with our panelists for the Q&A session. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Adima. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see that there's such an audience, and I think that these talks are really beneficial to the marketplace, especially in architecture. And yes, I just wanted to wish the ladies a happy Women's Month, and we really are appreciative that we are able to actually get involved with these talks. Enjoy, and chat to you guys soon. Thank you.
Building is more than assembling a structure, more than putting the pieces together. It's about building relationships, building trust, building pride. It's about having a vision and seeing it come to life as a testament to human strength and creativity. That's why we do what we do, driven by passion and powered by state-of-the-art technology. Safal Steel is an African thought leader in world-class building solutions that offer long-term sustainability. We are the only producer of aluminium zinc-coated products in South Africa, and each product in our range is made with pride and care. Our pre-painted color-coated steel sheets are lightweight, fire-resistant, weatherproof, eco-friendly, and energy-reflective. They are easy to install and highly durable, not to mention beautiful to look at. We also manufacture pre-painted coils, international quality, produced locally. At Safal Steel, quality assurance is a key priority. We demand extensive quality checks during manufacture, which is why we have confidence in our product warranty. Beyond our product offering, our services also include training, technical support during the building process, and expert knowledge resources. That's because we love being part of the journey, every step of the way. Safal Steel, building Africa together and building it with pride.
Thank you to Chris and Safal Steel. If we can invite our panelists to put your cameras on so we can pretend that we're in a room together, albeit virtually. Thanks, everyone. So we'd like to do a bit of a reflective session and address some of the questions and answers and some of the additional comments that have been coming in from our attendees. I'd like to read some of them that are coming in. So I'm going to look to the side of my screen every now and again. But from Penny Murray, well done to all involved today and to all the panelists for presenting such insightful and interesting, thought-provoking talks. As a white female architect, listening to what many of you have shared and faced in our industry helps me to understand. And that is the only way that things will change in our profession, is when this platform grows and where everyone's stories and voices can be heard to enable change for the better, particularly in the architectural profession. Penny, I think all of us couldn't agree more. Ava writes, dismantle the prejudice from within the institute. And I think that's a comment that came in after our discussion around Jabu's comment about creating new institutes. And I think exactly that, disrupt from within. I've been told many times before, and I'm sure many of you have, Jennifer, I'm sure this might sound familiar too, is that you need to be very polite about the way you seek to disrupt and to not be a bull in the china shop. And to be very ladylike about the way in which you engage with the realities. And it's like when I hear, and I've had many conversations with Karuni Naidu, who sits in our region, and I'm sure many of you have had these conversations with her, but when I hear that people with my lifetime's worth of experience, having suffered the same reactionary responses to just wanting to be their authentic selves in space, I don't know if there's much time or room for being too polite about what is so glaringly obvious in the face of these kinds of systems of oppression and exclusion that exist in our space. So I'm going to open up with Jennifer, I think, to some of the questions that came in. One of them specifically was for Katlego. Katlego, Kirsten McKenzie asks, how can we as women drive South Africa's green revolution in architecture?
Well, first of all, education is key. Understanding the constraints of our country in terms of just the capacity we have as women is critical, because in the decision-making process of any project you undertake, there's always land involved, whether it is the sourcing of materials from the sand to the timber, or it is the actual commissioning of the building when it comes to electricity consumption. Each and every building that we actually take the effort to retrofit, to build, to renovate, or whatever we endeavor to do, contributes to what we need as a country as a whole. I mean, if we're speaking about 61 million beds, which is a summary of the accommodation shortfalls we have, regardless of whether we're speaking about student accommodation, education, health, and all the other industries. The reality is we, as chief builders in the industry, have a responsibility to lead. The speed at which the industry moves means that every opportunity cannot be left without addressing, especially if it's put on your table, even if it means that you work with students that you are mentoring in order to understand their unfolding of their design process so that their products are also able to contribute to what we're doing. I mean, for every piece of, for every unit of building that you're producing, there's also the interior architecture, interior design, the furniture design, and so on and so forth. And when you look at the way women purchase, then we also need to make sure that our target market also is engaged in terms of what we're actually trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the response. We've got a question, and this will go to all panelists, ladies. The question is from the gentleman in the audience, and Mr. Peter is asking, how can a man participate and add to this discussion in a positive way? Okay, since we've had different panelists, I think I'm going to give all the panelists an opportunity because you're all very diverse and you're all very different. So in the order in which I see on the screen, I'll start with Boitumelo. So what do you want the men to do? How can a man participate?
I was actually thinking about this question, and I was like, it would be interesting to see or have a webinar where we have the men and the women on one table and see what the conversation comes at. And I think with men, when they come to the table, I think it's very important for them to be honest about their own prejudices, to be honest about what they see as problematic from their perspective, and be honest with it. When you come to a table with honesty and your prejudices, and like this is what it is, and you're willing to change it, that makes much more of it makes the space more welcoming, and it makes us feel like we are in a space where we can converse honestly and openly about how we change the narrative. And so as a male, I would say to you, be honest with yourself about your prejudices, and then start to work on
that. I like that. Men, just be honest. Okay, Bongeka, what do you want the men to do?
I think it just goes back to what Adima mentioned. I think what the quote was from Tim Menimke is about keeping the door open. I think a conversation like this can only enlighten, educate, and also just allow space for the other parties involved to evaluate and to do a bit of introspection. I think there are a lot of negative perceptions when we have a space like this, that we're venting, we're being emotional. And I think there's like a lot of negative perceptions about being emotional. Being emotional takes a lot of honesty and a lot of courage, in spaces where we don't feel welcome. So I think it's just taking accountability. And honestly, it's not about having to respond per se, but to acknowledge and then take that information and then apply it in whatever changes that are needed.
Awesome. Katlego, what do you want the men to do?
Well, we're speaking about a new table, but an invite to their table and a welcome clap or something is an acknowledgement that they really do want us at their table. I mean, with the influence as women that we have over their lives, we don't want to be resorting to manipulation tactics when it comes to making decisions regarding the future of the spaces that we want to create. And the desire to actually work together. I mean, to always be bulldozing your way into spaces in order to get the objective done, an objective which is actually something that we all have at the back of our heads or the back of our minds, is actually quite taxing and it's a waste of energy. So, like I said, a welcome gesture, an invite, so that we understand that it's not all talk. We are there to have a conversation and to work together. Thank you.
Mile, what do you want the men to do? I'm just taking notes. What do you want the men to do?
I think in addition to what everybody else has said, I think the willingness to listen. I don't think enough men actually care about the plight of women in our field. So I just think they must listen so that they can be aware of the part they play, because many of them do play a big part, even if it's just being, just. Many of them are good cops. They just glance over everything that's happening and prefer not to take a stance, so that they don't want to be involved. So they must be willing to listen so that they can actually be involved. So I think that's what they need to do.
Amazing. I wonder if we can take these notes and share them with women in South Africa in general. Some of these are cross-cutting. All right. Let's take Sonali. What do you want the men to do? How can they participate? How can they help?
I think in addition to what everyone has said, accountability and acknowledgement were the biggest things for me, and that they were the first things to pop into my mind. I also think validation of a female's experience within a profession that is male dominated goes such a long way. And sometimes we come to a point where we feel like we need to really, really justify those experiences as though they are not true. And so that kind of invalidation is really not a nice sort of feeling or way to progress, and it stunts the way that we speak about the profession or the way that we speak openly about the profession. So yeah, I think accountability and acknowledgement, and definitely the ability to listen and kind of gauge what is coming through in that point.
Amazing. Leila, I see you've got a team of ladies with you, so we'll take your whole team. I see you're about 3 or 4 there. Okay, we'll take all of you. What do you want the men to do?
Yeah.
How can they participate?
I think to echo what Michele said about listening, like for me, I think it starts with listening, because a lot of the issues that were spoken about today, although like some of the issues are quite nuanced, they're not in secret and they don't happen like underground. It's very obvious things that we as women experience and observe on a daily basis. And I think just the acknowledgement of men as our allies in like the office environment, or as our colleagues or as our classmates, to just observe that if there are disparities or discrepancies happening, or there's unequal treatment of women, that can be acknowledged and observed, and understanding that women's issues are not like specific and doesn't need to only be held within women and amongst other women. Like it's things that affect men and everyone. And yeah, it's just like these things we see happen, and people need to just acknowledge that it's happening, and then we start having the conversation of saying what can change and what can we do differently.
Great. And the ladies you are with in the same room?
I think, yeah, I just echo what David said.
You agree with Leila?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll agree. Okay, great. I think that's one of the questions that came in, and thanks, Peter, for asking this. I think it's a very gentleman gesture from you to ask the ladies, so we hear you. So what can we do differently? What can we change? That's what the aim of today. Rethink. So how can we help? And then we got another comment from Isabel. I think this was read, but we can look at it again. Isabel van Veek, she says, as a woman in architecture, I've experienced isolation and the feeling that I do not belong to this industry. I think that's been echoed largely by many, many of the ladies today. I think the new table must represent all women in architecture. An equal weight between women in practice and academics. I think the second session's focus was more on women of color and academics and studies. I think let's just revisit this one, equal weight between women in practice and women in academics. I think, Sonali, let's just get back to you on this one. What's your take on this? How can we achieve an equal weight? Because you did mention that you're in academia, and I know you're a PhD candidate. So how can we, what are your views? How do we make this balance? And I heard you said you've also worked a bit, at least for some part of your life. So now that you've worked and you're now in academia, so how can we achieve the equal weight as we think about the new table?
I think that that's such a weighted question. It's a very loaded question almost, and I've been thinking about it quite a lot since I've started working in academia, because I felt this sort of disconnection when I started working here. And I think it's been mentioned by other panelists today as well, is this idea of industry partnerships making a bigger appearance within our educational spaces as well. Industry partnerships and industry leaders, and feeling like we're not just educators, but we're also contributing towards that new generation of designers, of creatives, of architects. And I sometimes lose sight of that. Sometimes think of it as teaching or just lecturing, and it's never just one thing. It's so multifaceted. There's so many ways of looking at it, and there's so many different elements that when graduates leave our universities, they can go into different sorts of fields and different sorts of places. And that's probably why not everyone who graduates with an architecture degree becomes an architect, because there's so many opportunities, and there's just so many other things that we don't really consider that much. And I guess I'm taking it a little bit back here, and I'm taking it going a little off book here and saying that it does kind of could stem back to interdisciplinarity at some point as well, whereby we start to engage in interdisciplinary work at that early stage of our careers, at that early stage of academic development in undergraduates and postgraduate studies, and then also start to make those kinds of industry connections and linkages, so that we don't feel so disconnected as students, but feel more a part of the profession. I think that could be one of the ways. I'm sure there are many, many more.
Yeah, I think that's useful. And I also want to recap on the opening statement from Isabel as well. As a woman architecture, I've experienced a lot of isolation and the feeling that I don't belong to the industry. I think if we've got any men online, we'd like to hear from you as well, because we might actually find that this is not a gender issue. You might find that there's so many architects, especially the younger generation of architects, that come out in the field, and because of the pressures to try and find a job, to try and move from candidate to profession, I'm just throwing out there, could it be that the issue about feeling that you don't belong to this industry is not really a gender issue? I mean, could it be? Because if you look at some of what's on Twitter, if you follow Facebook a lot and you see some of the complaints coming from architects, complaints come from men and women. And so could it be, could we consider the possibility that the whole issue of the stress and the belonging and a lot of what we've talked about here, staying up all night, I'm sure it wasn't only women staying up all night, I'm sure even men were staying up all night to study. And I'm just saying, could it be? Could it also be some of the things we've talked about, the effort about staying up studio all night? Maybe was it only Black, or was it only colored, or everybody was doing that? I'm just throwing it out there. Could it be? Could it just be? Maybe I'll take some of your comments, and as you give some of your closing remarks, maybe you can reflect on some of these things. I mean, could it be? I'm just asking it. Could it be that some of these are cross-cutting across a generation? For instance, you find that because we have so many schools of architecture now than we had in the past. I think when I started, it was only University of Cape Town, or maybe 2 or 3, but now we have so many schools of architecture. We've got so many graduates coming out. So could it be that it's actually not about the woman in architecture or the girl or the Black woman in architecture, but could it be that younger generation of architects are finding it difficult to find their space or their seat at the table within the profession? Just some food for thought as we remember, I'm just a facilitator, so we're just asking these questions. So I'll just go round all the panelists again, and as I take some of your concluding remarks, then I'll come in with a conclusion of the day between session 1 and session 2. So in no particular order, I'll start with Bongeka.
Well, I guess I'd have to agree to a certain extent that it's not just a gender issue, that gender sort of highlights that there are other areas of stratification that allow us to experience inequality and exclusion. And for me, I think it stems from the lack of community within the architectural fraternity. Even the fact that it's called a fraternity, I actually don't know the faces behind the fraternity. And it goes back to what Karine was saying, in that there should be sort of like a dismantling of the existing powers. But even talking about that is very sophisticated, because I don't have access to who is actually in power and who decides some of the policies that are put in place. So I just think it also, in the spirit of creating a new table, those are the type of questions that we have to ask, and we need to also be able to hold people accountable and be able to ask those questions and actually get answers. Because I just also think that the existing community only allows for a certain part of the community to be sustainable and to grow and to have connections. So even if you do want to open your own practice, you are sort of designed for failure, because you don't have access, because information is sort of, there's like a gatekeeping that is, that displays itself in the industry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll just take a question that's come onto the platform, and that's from Nompilo. She says, I'm reading it as it comes, as it came. Keeping the same institutions is like keeping the ANC in power. I'm reading it as she said it. Sure, they've made progress, but will they take us forward? Yes, it's a question. Will they take us forward? I guess that's to all the panelists, but also to the online guests. Will they take us forward? And then we'll have, let me take another panelist, Katlego, some of your closing remarks, but also some of reflections on some of the things that are coming up.
When it comes to architecture and politics, having lived through a transition from the old government into the new government of our current political systems, I've realized that our work transcends politics to a certain extent. In the efforts that we undertake now, whether in an educational facility or in industry to construct buildings, that work lives past politics. And in acknowledging that, yes, we have systems we need to comply with, policies that we need to align to, but the grander picture is that with technologies changing, with political ideologies changing through generations, then we need to always have it in the back of our minds that this, whatever the challenge we're going through now is temporary, and we will have to work through it. It does not work in the current scenario. In conclusion, ladies, thank you for inviting us. I am glad that we are forming a table which is based on encouraging unity within the industry. Yes, I agree with you, Bongeka. There is a weakness that we have in the industry in terms of our lack of unity. As women, we understand that the power of one versus the power of many, the many trump the one. So in our efforts, I think continuing to talk, continuing to align with each other in terms of the end objective, which is to build, is critical in terms of what we want to eventually achieve, whether it's in our careers, in our personal lives, or as a body of women in South Africa. Thank you.
I think that's very useful. I like that you said that the unity, and as we talked about today, and I know some of the comments on chat said today was about the women of color, but I like the way maybe it turned out it appeared that way to some of the online guests, but it was beyond color. So I like what you're saying, Katlego, it's about unity. How do we move forward to this new table in unity? Remember, it's a table. So if we sit at the table and we're fighting at the table, the table won't hold, you know? Then we have flying chairs at the table. So how do we move together and sit together at this table in unity? A comment from Chumile that says, such a thought-provoking webinar and presentations from today. Thank you for raising these ideas. As a practicing member in the profession who is of color, I found myself relating to a lot of these issues brought up today. I hope that's something that can be done that will bring these ideas into light, away from just being topics of discussion, but being topics of action in the working world. I think that's also beautiful. But also, I think coming here to talk is also good because did you know everyone around the country was experiencing the same thing, for instance? Did you know that what the architects in Johannesburg are experiencing it's in Cape Town, it's in Free State? I mean, did you know that? So I think there's some beauty in coming and talking because, I mean, we live strengthened. So wherever you are watching from the country, participating from, I think we walk out of here strengthened because we know that it's not just me, it's not just you. Everybody is fighting the same battle. So, Leila, your concluding remarks.
I think Chelsea can give some.
Sure. So I think like in this, to everyone's talks, it was so slightly disheartening, I guess, to think that it's been the status quo for such a long time, but that there are also to note that there are some positives coming out of the current like student space and university space in architecture. There are good movements of the Y perspective, the Y project and her perspective and things like that. And this talk today and being a part of this table as students who are exiting university and moving into the working space, that this is like a move towards something positive and that we can continue this and that it's not all like doom and gloom, but that there is a way forward. So thank you also to everyone who participated today and for allowing the three of us to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor having you, and thanks for taking the time. And I like what you said. It's not all doom and gloom. And I think one of the panelists also mentioned that earlier, that it's for a season. I think some of the panelists in session one would also narrate the same things, but maybe also see how beautiful it changed as they got older. I'll take Midley, your closing remarks.
No, I think I'd like to just reiterate the fact that, no, as you said, it is not all. I think there are many strides being taken, you know, to accommodate women and make them more visible in our male-dominated field. I do think, you know, to agree with Mongega, yes, male students suffer the same struggles as female students do, but we must acknowledge that the female struggle, more especially the Black female struggle, is intersectional issues. It's not the same. So I think we have to acknowledge that the struggles are not the same. The level of struggle is not the same. We don't only have to deal as Black students, I speak for myself, we don't only have to deal with the woes of late nighters, all-nighters and, you know, overproductivity. We also have to deal with being overlooked because we are women. You know, your ideas never being good enough because you're a Black woman. You know, there's a myriad of things that we face that I feel, for instance, white men can't attest to. So it's very important to highlight that the struggle is not the same, and let's not make a mistake about that. That's just my opinion, but yeah, very happy for this platform. May it go forward, and yeah, I'm looking forward to, you know, hearing more of this as the webinar series continues. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mikle. I like what you're saying. It's not the same. I think as part of the discussion earlier, I think one of the panelists in this group also said the chair at the table, it's different for everybody. So I think I like what you're saying, that we cannot downplay everyone's story and everyone's experience. And I think we can't underestimate that. But the beauty of it is knowing that it's for a season and there's hope, and things can change. I think, and what we also acknowledge is the energy. I mean, look at the energy that the collective has brought to this session. I think that's the beauty, that's the hope, that's the excitement that this brings to this webinar today. So Nali, you've spoken extensively, so I will give Botomelo concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm just going to refer back to this morning when Prof. Amira shared her own perspective in terms of how she's seen in tables and when she comes to the table. And sometimes I think it's important that when you come to the table, you're seen as a Black female architect, when you're seen as an architect, it's important for you to be okay with that, and therefore reflect and say sometimes it's not up to you to change someone else, but let them sit with their perspectives, let them sit with their prejudices, and come to the table and come as you are, and be upfront in terms of how you present yourself in that table. And I'm going to end with just a quote from the author of Lee Eng. She says, "We cannot change what we are not aware of. Once we are aware of what we can do, we cannot help but change it." And I think that's very important. When you are aware, you're self-aware of what's happening, all the things we've discussed today, it's up to us to say this is how we're going to change it. And so when you come to the table and you are present, the next person doesn't have a choice because they are aware of it. They will need to change themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll just punctuate that with a compliment to all of the panelists. Thank you so much to all our panelists, and everything you have presented is such a wonderful reflection, but also as a perpetual concern because the industry is shifting so slowly, okay? But it's shifting. Good news, it's shifting. Okay, the industry is shifting so slowly. I found it a very useful presentation to learn from the powerful panelists and also to find validation in how I have and do experience the field. So that's a compliment to all the panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. You have left us extremely empowered. And I'm confident that out of this, whoever attended this session, I think when we go back to practice, when we go back to the Institute, I think now we see the sense of urgency. It's not business as usual, because now we have had from different people, from different places, same story, same pain, similar challenges. So now we see that it's important to change the industry faster. Lastly, Lynette, your closing remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to just go back a little on what Mongeka said earlier, that I think it's time within our fraternity to take mentorship very seriously and not just speak about it. And it goes back to, I think, what the panelists have said in many ways, whereby it's nice to speak, but it would be nice to also start doing. And we start doing with the small portions of contribution that we do, whether it's within the office or it's within taking somebody into your office as a form of mentorship, and really instilling mentorship for what it is, so that you create a sustainable industry within architecture. And I think that also breeds better professionals that will also transfer the same energy, the same knowledge, and will have the strong industry that won't be likely to die anytime, because it had strong mentors who took accountability within their mentorship and took mentorship seriously. And this also includes men. So it goes back to what the gentleman said earlier, how do men get involved? Men get involved through listening. and really listening and actually doing. And I guess the part here would be, your part to do would be to take accountability. And if you are a mentor or a teacher, take that role seriously, so that at the end of the day, you would have been so proud with yourself that, hey, that student taught somebody else 5 years down the line. So yeah, my last words are, let's create a more sustainable and inclusive environment for those that are yet to come as well, be it male, be it female, female color, females, yeah, generally. So it doesn't matter, it shouldn't be limited to race, gender, or what was the other one? I think the lady said it earlier. Yeah, race, gender, sexuality, correct. So that's all from me.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists. The Institute is extremely proud of you. Thank you so much for taking the time, doing the presentations, coming out to speak, the quality of work, the courage to speak, the way you did it, the unity, I mean, it was out of this world. Thank you so much. I'm sure the audience is applauding as well. It's online, we can't see all of them, but the Institute, and I'm sure some of the older architects are extremely proud of you. And thank you so much. Please do this again and again and again. Do not give up. Thank you so much. We are extremely proud of you. I'd just like to conclude so what do we take from here? When we started the day, we started with the part about reimagining leadership to achieve gender equity. And we had 4 panelists in the session. And what came out very strongly from that session was that, firstly, is that we have to have the courage to be leaders within this current climate. The climate is complex, make no doubt. The climate is difficult, make no doubt. But things have changed. We have technology. We have new systems. We have, everything is different. So based on session 1, we had to reimagine gender equity within the lines of leadership. We were able to re-examine, to retrace, to weigh what has worked, what has not worked, and what we want differently, what we want to remain the same. Lucky for us, the current SAIA president is a lady. So I think it creates a broader platform as well for more voices to be heard. So from this morning, we were able to think again and to reconsider what is our new position in terms of gender equity as South Africans, especially as women in architecture in South Africa. And everyone was very clear, but 2 words stood out. One is the courage to lead. Secondly is the courage to be your authentic self. And thirdly is the courage to be progressive. So from the second session, it was about the new table. Therefore, what have we seen from the new table? We have said so many things, but I will conclude 3 key points. Firstly, we have a table. I mean, that's good news. We have a table. Now, the challenge for today was to create a new table. So, coming out of the session 2, what does this new table look like? Firstly, I like one of the sessions, the words that were on the table, which was, if you don't see a seat at the table, I added my own, if you did not receive an invite to the table, bring your folding chair. I think that's really, that's the cream of today. If you don't see a seat at the table, if you were not invited at the table, if you did not know about the table and you stumbled upon this table, bring your folding chair, stand around the table, just be at the table. Secondly, all are welcome at the table. All races are welcome at the table. Everyone has a role to play. We've clearly said it's about unity, equity, inclusivity, and embracing our diversity at this table. Thirdly, you and I must want to partake at the table. We can talk about this table, we can criticize the table, we can praise the table, but you and I must want to be a part of the table. And no one can force you and I to be part of the table. There is a table. If there is no seat, bring your seat, bring your folding chair, stand around the table, but you and I must want to be at the table. Fourthly, we need to embrace the families at the table. That's the other professions that we as architects work with, your engineers, your landscape architects, your surveyors, your interior designers, and so on. The courage to embrace and work with the other families at the table. I like the other one that came out very strongly as well. Come as you are at the table. Doesn't matter where you're coming from, what you've been through, broken and whole, come as you are at the table. Excited, discouraged, tired, feeling brand new, come as you are at the table. You don't see a seat, bring your seat. Lastly, it takes courage to sit at the table. The table is complex, it's shaky. Some of these seats, you can be shaken off and fall off your seat. Therefore, it takes courage to sit at the table, stay at the table, enjoy the table, and remain within the system that makes the table. It takes courage. Ladies and gentlemen, to all our panelists who have joined us since morning, Session 1, Session 2, I honestly thank you for all your participation. It's been mind-blowing. We are renewed, revived, refreshed. In the words of, I hear this a lot in some of the other circles, I hear the word upwards and forwards. I think after today, there is no doubt that it's in architecture. As long as we have a table, it's about moving the table upwards and forwards. We're not backing out. We are at the table. Whether we have a seat or not, we are part of this table. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event. They've spoken previously in between the sessions. We thank the Still for sponsoring this event. Safal Still, I was trying to say it in full. Okay, you got me on that one. I wanted to say it in full. Safal Still, thank you so much for your sponsorship. The architecture fraternity is extremely grateful for the investment that you've done for us. It's because of you that we're able to come together and sit at the table, reimagine this table, rebuild the table, and strengthen the materials at the table. I also want to thank the ECPD organizing team. Ladies, you have done a stunning job. The time it took to organize this, bring it together, and ensure that it was successful. Thank you so much. And we also thank our online audience. We don't take the courage to stay online for long. Thank you so much for being part of this audience, the participation, the questions, the provocative thoughts. Thank you so much. And we will have you invited to more CPD seminars, more voices, more sessions are coming throughout the year through 2023. Keep coming. We are now at the table. You're not leaving the table. We are staying together at the table. I'd like to hand back to our organizers to play just a few more videos. To our online audience and our panelists, please stay to the end. We have some more videos coming right from the sponsor to the organizing team and some more words of motivation as we partake at the table. My name is Jennifer Mirembe. I've been your facilitator for both sessions, and thank you so much for the privilege of staying with me.
Every minute of every day, the SAIA Group is working to make products that make a world of difference. To homeowners and business owners, to families and to communities. The SAIA Group is a multinational company with operations covering Eastern, Central and Southern Africa. The group is Africa's largest producer of steel roofing and sheeting and the first producer of aluminium zinc-coated steel on the continent. With over 36 businesses and insights gathered over 50 years, the SAIA Group has remained at the forefront in providing products that lead the industry. The group opened its first manufacturing facility in Mombasa, Kenya in 1962 and has grown steadily, now operating in 12 countries, using the world's leading aluminium zinc metal coating technology and state-of-the-art color coating processes to produce the coil used by its roofing operations. The outputs of more than 30 roof manufacturing operations make the SAIA Group the largest producer of metal roof sheeting in Africa. A full range of associated products are also available to provide a complete solution from one trusted source. The group is founded on a bold vision: to make a world of difference. The SAIA Group roofing operations strive to provide customers with the best metal products they can afford, suiting all applications, from residential homes to offices, commercial and industrial applications. Steel sheeting is roll-formed in factories or on-site, in various profiles and finishes, and supplied complete with accessories for a complete roofing solution. At the group's metal coating plants, steel is coated to give it a longer lifespan. The SAIA Group was the first producer of aluminium zinc-coated steel in Africa, the world's most advanced coating alloy to deliver an extended service life to steel. Metal-coated steel is sold under the brand name Zincal. Color-coated Zincal is sold under the brand names Color Plus, Optima and Optima Plus, in an array of popular colors that are both durable and beautiful. To complement its roofing brands, specialist products have been developed by the SAIA Group, such as the fixed-tight fastener products, steel pipes and hollow sections, and other value-added accessories for the building industry. The SAIA Group lays great store on being a socially responsible corporate citizen. Its focus is primarily on the communities in which it operates, particularly those who are most affected by poverty and social disadvantage. The group also supports innovators who serve as role models for community upliftment. Steel is uniquely placed to help communities across Africa meet the challenges of development in a sustainable, responsible manner. And at the end of its life, steel is 100% recyclable, helping minimize the impact of the built environment on our precious planet. The SAIA Group is committed to finding solutions today for a better tomorrow and to making a world of difference.